What's going on, Packer fans? Welcome back to an all-new episode of the Pack a Day podcast, joined again by Paul Bretl, co-branded today with the Packers Wire. Make sure to follow Paul over on Twitter at Paul_Bretl. You can follow me at Andy Herman NFL. Paul, it has been a week. We do not get a victory to talk about this week. I think most people are relatively positive coming out of this game, at least from an offensive point of view. But let me ask you first, how are you doing and how are you feeling about this past Packer game?
I'm doing fantastic. Always happy to join you here, Andy, and talk through the previous Packers game. And I feel good. I mean, yeah, they ended up with a loss. That stinks. We want to see wins for the most part, but this loss definitely did not feel like the previous ones, the ones that were on that 4-game winning streak. We saw that progress that we're all looking for.
Yeah, I said hang the banner, best Packers loss of the season. I don't know if you get any points for that or whatever, but no, it did feel a little bit different. I think these are the sort of losses that we came into the season expecting a little bit more. Where tough game on the road. I don't think the Steelers are all that great, but it's still the Steelers always play tough every single season. It's always tough to win in Pittsburgh, which is evidenced by the fact that they haven't won there since 1970 or whatever it was. So to go in there and win is always tough, but I thought they were extremely competitive, had a really big call that went against them, looked better on offense, carried over some of the successes from the game against the Rams into Pittsburgh, and really kind of stacked a little bit of that. I like defense and special teams we can go over as well, which was not as exciting. But I think if you're playing competitive football in these type of games, especially on the road, that's a step in the right direction. And I was relatively happy with the result, despite it being a loss.
Yeah, I absolutely agree.
Let's start on the offensive side of the ball. I want to actually kick things off today with Luke Musgrave because it's funny. With tight ends, it's so hard for tight ends, unless you're Travis Kelce, to be like wow players sometimes. Obviously, Gronk, Jimmy Graham in his prime, there have been examples of tight ends that have been big-time impact players. But I feel like Luke Musgrave is going a little bit under the radar just for his overall play as a rookie tight end. I think he's playing net positive football. The blocking is not great, but it's still ahead of where I expected it to be for a rookie tight end who didn't do a ton of it in college, not because they didn't ask him to, but just more because he just didn't play a ton. I still think he's, like I said, ahead of the 8 ball right now from a blocking standpoint. We've all been sort of waiting for these big explosive plays in the passing game to sort of pan out a little bit better. We saw 2 big plays from Love to Musgrave this week. This felt a little bit different, and I think it's time that we start talking a little bit more about Musgrave in the season that he's having.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, those explosive plays, those were the things that had been missing from Luke Musgrave on this Packers team. I think we talked about it during a previous week. Like, they were doing a good job of getting him involved. Like, he was, I think, coming into the last 2 weeks, 3rd on the team in targets. It's not as if he's been forgotten about, but he's been targeted around the line of scrimmage, I think, just in an effort to at least get the ball in his hands, give him the opportunity to make some of those splash plays through yards after the catch opportunities. But like we talked about previously, that's not how you truly maximize what Luke Musgrave can bring to this offense. The last 2 weeks, however, we've seen that play down the seam, those deep throws over the middle. I mean, that's what he brings to this offense, that, you know, ability to create mismatches, that speed, athleticism, the size of his in the open space. Like, that's what you're searching for. When that pick came in back in April, that's what you were assuming that this Packers team was getting. So it's good to see them finally recognizing that potential, getting Luke Musgrave those opportunities, because it can open up so much within this offense. I think the last time I used the word gravity when discussing Luke Musgrave, because he can be that guy who attracts defenders to him, helping to create better spacing, better opportunities for others out there in the passing game as well, even if the ball isn't coming in his direction. And to the blocking standpoint, I asked Adam Stenovich last week about it, just kind of what were his overall thoughts on Musgrave and Kraft together in terms of how are they progressing as blockers. And of course, added the caveat, there's a long ways to go, which we have to keep in mind, but he's happy with the strides that they made. I think since day one, we've always seen that Musgrave's been a willing blocker. Like, that is not, that it's never been an issue. It's just the mechanics of it, the technique of it. And we are seeing that progression. I think that Rams game is a really good example of the growth that he's had as a blocker. On that Aaron Jones touchdown run, he had a really nice seal to help create that running lane for him. They had blockers at the second level. Aaron Jones walks in, and even on his touchdown reception, like he had to absolutely sell that block, which he did an excellent job of, to get the linebacker to bite towards that fake on the right, left the middle of the field open for him. Like, are those plays that happen in week 1 or week 2? No, I can't say for certain, but I'm going to guess maybe not to that level or that effect given his play. So I think those are two really good examples of the progression that we've seen from him in the run game. And as a result, we've seen a lot less, not solely for this reason, but we've seen a lot less of Josiah DeGuara in recent weeks as well. And when you draft a Luke Musgrave, you draft a Tucker Kraft, you claim a Ben Sims off waivers, like I imagine the ideal plan or part of the plan was always going to be Josiah DeGuara's role being phased out as the season went on. But his playing time has really fallen off a cliff. The first, I believe, 6 games of the season, DeGuara averaged almost 21 snaps per game. Over the last 3, he has 23 combined. Like Luke Musgrave's been tight end 1 since he stepped in Green Bay, but I think his progression in terms of the pass catching abilities as a blocker specifically, we're seeing Tucker Kraft's role grow as well. And then as a result, and partially due to his performance, Josiah DeGuara is being worked out of that equation in terms of snaps, playing time, and contributions.
I had no snaps for Ben Sims this week either, which was an interesting one. And you have seen that like it's basically been a takeover by Luke Musgrave and Tucker Kraft for those tight end snaps, which I love. And I'm glad you brought up Tucker Kraft as well, because I do think his attention to detail in the blocking game has been a night and day difference from day one up until now. One of the things one of my first impressions of Tucker Kraft is he was working off to the sides with the tight ends coach, and he's doing something, and his coach was about to tell him what he did wrong. And he before he even said it, he's like, yeah, I know it's too high. Like, I know, like he was already mad at himself. Like he knew the coaching point. He knew what he did wrong. He didn't even need to be told. And then he's like, and he wanted to do it again. And you could just tell like there was this great desire from him to be better at it, to learn. And I've been really impressed as a blocker with Tucker Kraft's progress. And I think that is going to pay dividends for Kraft, where if he can really sell as a blocker that he's going to block on the majority of plays, then all of a sudden you get some of those leak plays for Tucker Kraft. And I think that's when he's going to become far more dangerous. As far as Musgrave, I am biting my tongue a little bit because we have been burned with second-year players in the past. We can look at Christian Watson right now, who are like, oh my goodness, look what he did as a rookie. Imagine what he's going to be in year 2. And so far, year 2 has not been what year 1 was. And that, unfortunately, has been a bit of a trend. Josh Myers went drastically backwards in year 2. Eric Stokes went majorly backwards in year 2. So we cannot just assume that year 2 is going to be better than year 1. But theoretically, on paper, this should be the baseline for Luke Musgrave moving forward and what we should expect. And if he does continue to improve, and I do think that like you can tell with Luke, and I think part of like the stumbling after the catch and all of the sort of things that people are noticing is the fact that the game has not slowed down for him yet. That doesn't mean he's not ultra talented. That doesn't mean that he's like, not helping this team, but you can tell he's still going a bit too fast, trying to do a bit too much. And again, the game just hasn't slowed down. I do think if that time does come and he does take a second or third year jump, whenever that is, and the game slows down for him, look out, because this is what he's doing when the game is still a little bit fast. And I'm really, really still excited about what he can be as a long-term prospect at tight end.
Yeah, there was that story or example from Matt LaFleur a few weeks ago in practice where he looked at Musgrave and he goes, it doesn't always, depending on the play, the route, what the defense is doing, it doesn't always have to be 100 miles an hour. Run this at 90 miles an hour for me. And I think that speaks perfectly to what you were just describing there, moving, at light speed with that big frame of his. And just to touch on the blocking once more, again, this is a piece of the puzzle. There's a lot of things that have changed, from offensive line play being better, obviously the return of Aaron Jones, but as the tight ends have progressed with their blocking, we're seeing in recent weeks a more productive, not great, but a more productive version of this Packers running game. I think Jones and Dillon in the last 3 games are averaging just under 4.5 yards per carry between the two of them. I mean, they're finding more success. And as we talked about after that Rams game, even it doesn't have to be these massive chunk plays. It's even this, like the Steelers game, they weren't ripping off these huge runs other than the AJ Dillon one, but they're at least netting positive plays for the most part. It was a 3-yard gain, a 4-yard gain, at least keeping you with the sticks, at least keeping you or putting you ahead of the sticks sometimes, which keeps the Packers out of those doom situations, those 2nd and 3rd and longs, and just changes the complexion of everything on a drive from the play calling standpoint, taking some of the control away from the defense. So again, tight ends are a small piece of that puzzle, long ways to go in the blocking game, but I think that their progression in that respect is helping the run game as well.
There might be another couple that I'm not thinking of, but outside of that 5-yard loss and right in the 2-minute drill where they had to they lost 5 yards, it was a run pass option. They chose the pass. The corner did not bite on Dobbs whatsoever, and Dobbs didn't really sell it at all or block at all, whatever he's supposed to do on that play. And Reed gets tackled for the 5-yard loss, and then they decide to just kind of punt on the drive. But outside of that, there were not the negative plays in the backfield quite as much.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the big things, as you mentioned, that are just absolute drive killers. And that's the thing that, going back to the Rams game, where you could see much more positive runs and far fewer negative runs. And I thought that carried over. Maybe not, again, super efficient running the ball at all times, especially I know Jones had a tough time getting going more due to the blocking than anything Jones was doing wrong. But it still, to me, is trending in the right direction, better than it was in the handful of weeks prior to that. I want to stick on the offensive side of the ball because I know on your timeline you had an interesting statistic out there. Luke Musgrave, Jaden Reed, Dontavian Wicks this week, 199 of the 289 passing yards this week. Love went to those 3 rookies early and often, and it was a lot of the explosive plays. Reed for the touchdown, Reed on the big one on the final drive. You've got Wicks on the ad-lib play that looked very Aaron Rodgers-esque, where he navigated the pocket, rolled right through across his body left. The 2 big plays down the field to Musgrave. This is one of the things that is giving me a lot of optimism. And I know there's been a lot of, talk of the Christian Watson and whatever's going on there. I have to say, long-term, the Musgrave, and we'll see where Kraft ends up as a playmaker sort of player. It's just going to take some time there, but the Musgrave, Reed, Wicks, Dobbs, Watson group of 5 is something that I am extremely excited about. And I was talking to Nagler on Monday about this a little bit. It's funny, everyone's like, Green Bay, they're going to need a number 1 wide receiver. They got to get a number 1 wide receiver. The thing I talked about with Aaron is how quickly we forget that in year 1 and year 2, about the only dynamic wide receiver of the Favre Rodgers era that was that good in year 1 or year 2, where they were like the guy, number 1 wide receiver, was Greg Jennings. Driver was not, Freeman was not, Jones was not, Cobb was not, Devontae was not, Nelson was not. We can go on and on. The top tier, it didn't happen overnight. And even if you look at when Jermichael Finley, it took till year 3 until we started to see that jump. For Jordy, it was a little bit later. For all those guys, it took a little bit of time. Donald Driver was not. So the fact that these guys are putting up some of these numbers in year 1, specifically with Reed, Wicks, and Musgrave, I am still extremely excited about this group of playmakers long-term. And I think it's only going to get better and better and better as time goes on.
Yeah, we're really starting to see those rookies gain traction. Like you said, they had between the 3 of them, 10 receptions on 13 targets, 199 yards. Of those 10 receptions, 5 of them were explosive plays for that trio. And as the game unfolds and the Packers inevitably run into those situations where it's end of game and they need a score, those guys are emerging as hopefully what can become some go-to options for Jordan Love in those situations. Because as we know right now, he's relying really, really heavily on Christian Watson in those end of game situations to come up with those big throws. And I'm curious your thoughts on this, but I do wonder if at times there's a predetermining on Love's part of, all right, I got my 6'4" receiver, runs a 4.36 on the outside. It's a go-to a must-have it situation. That's where I'm going with the ball. And I think that first interception is, it's one example, but I think it portrays that a little bit because, Love, he did a good job of looking off the safety. The ball placement, like LaFleur said, could have been a little bit better, but wasn't this egregious play by any means. But Matt LaFleur said, given the Pittsburgh Steelers coverage, the ball was never intended to go there. That was not the intent of the play. And so I do wonder, again, trying to take advantage of Patrick Peterson's aggressiveness was something that Love had mentioned. And he's got his big receiver on the outside. If there was a little bit of, all right, this is where I'm going with the ball regardless, because of the matchup that he liked. And if you have other guys like a Musgrave, a Reed, a Wicks, who continue to progress and come up in those big situations, hopefully Love doesn't have to have that feeling of this is where I have to go with the ball. And there's those other opportunities out there for them. And the chunk play aspect that we've seen in recent weeks, like the Steelers game was kind of a culmination so far of the trio's best performance, but they've been building up to that. Jaden Reed, I think in 5 of the 9 games this season has a 30-yard reception. Dontavian Wicks continues to find ways to get the ball in key situations. As we mentioned, Luke Musgrave, 4 explosive plays in the last 2 weeks. Like, this is a building up that we've seen, and it kind of all came together in that Steelers game. And that big play aspect is, as we all know, something that's been missing from this offense. For one thing, without it, it's a tough life to live in the NFL when you got to string together 10, 12 play drives to go and score, and have to do that routinely, especially when you have an offense that's been as mistake prone as the Packers. From how the opponent plays you. Like, if they're not afraid of the deep ball, they're going to shrink things, going to make running the ball difficult. The intermediate, middle, short area throws more challenging. So there's just a whole new world that can be opened up if the Packers are able to, unlock that aspect of their game, relatively efficiently speaking, in terms of the types of throws. But just a massive step forward from this group. And in addition to just Love's play that we saw on Sunday, talking about progress for this offense, the contributions from those 3, specifically generating chunk plays, was huge.
Yeah, it's really an interesting thought on predetermining to Watson. I can say if I was probably playing quarterback, I would probably predetermine to Watson on a decent amount of plays too, just because of the raw natural talent that he has. 6'4", 6'5", 4. Yeah, that's a guy that you probably want to get the ball to down the field and hope that he's going to go up and get. Obviously, that hasn't exactly worked out. 5 of Love's 10 interceptions have been targeting Christian Watson. So yeah, I think that connection just hasn't come along. But I do think there is, like, you could tell early on Love had that level of trust with Romeo Doubs and was giving him some of those balls. And then more as of late, he's been trying to get those to Watson. And now I think you're starting to see him start to throw a little bit more to Dontavian Wicks and Jaden Reed and let them have some of those opportunities. And your hope is, long-term, and whether it's Musgrave or Wicks or Reed or Doubs or Watson, it's not so much a predetermination. It's not so much of like, all right, who do I trust in this situation? You develop trust with all those guys, know where they're going to be, and you go to the best option that's out on the field. And I think that's a easier thing said than done for a young quarterback in this league, because you do feel a safety valve, or just have that level of trust in a player that you've played with a little bit more, that maybe does have a little bit of that raw natural talent that's a little bit bigger. But at the end of the day, as I've said about wide receiver for a long time, this is a game of separation. And it's not to say that Christian can't separate right now with that insane speed, and we've seen it, and they need to hit on some of those deep throws. But Dontavian Wicks, Jaden Reed, we're seeing them get a little bit more consistent separation, and I think becoming more involved and more targeted because of that. And kudos to Wes Hodkiewicz as well, who pointed out Jaden Reed now has 7 30-plus yard receptions on the season, which is tied for second in the NFL, behind only Tyreek Hill, which is just a really incredible statistic, and just shows you this is not just your in and out gadget slot wide receiver. This is somebody who has the ability to get behind the defense and make those big explosive plays. I think more of it is going to come, and it has the ability to be a real big weapon for this Packers offense moving forward.
Yeah, you had a line last week when we were having our conversation that I really liked. We were talking about the contested catches, and you said something to the effect of, how about instead of always having to make contested catches, how about we get some separation to create some easier throws? And to your point, Wicks has, from day one, he's been really, really good at that. I mean, Jordan Love just talked about it last week. His release off the line of scrimmage, he called him shifty, was his ability to work around cornerbacks, create that separation. And we're seeing that more consistently from Jaden Reed as well. As you mentioned from that stat from Wes, like, the big play potential has been there since week 1, since the season started for him. Now it's just about that consistency factor, and we're starting to see that progress.
So a couple things I want to go over that unfortunately aren't going according to plan. I want to start with the red zone offense. Only 3 touchdowns in their last 13 drives in the red zone, which has been clearly not good enough. It starts with offensive line play. And as Matt LaFleur mentioned earlier this week, you have to be able to run the ball in the red zone just to set everything else up. I think it was Tom Silverstein. I think it was last week. It was asked, like, why are we not seeing, some of those play action fakes where you end up with like a tight end wide open in the end zone, or defense is doing something different. And I think it was a smart question. And as I was thinking about it more, it's like, well, you got to be able to have the threat of running the football first before you can play action and get those tight ends wide open. If you don't have to oversell and have everyone coming up to stop the run, well, then you're not going to get tight ends open in the back of the end zone. But your thoughts on Green Bay's struggles in the red zone as of late?
Yeah, I wrote about that after the game because that was just obviously such a big determining factor in the outcome. They had 5 trips to the red zone against the Steelers, which is awesome. That's excellent. But obviously only converted one of them into a touchdown. And even over the last 3 games, those 13 red zone trips that you mentioned, that's 4.3 a game. That's absurd. That's really, really good. And and especially in recent weeks, we keep hearing more and more kind of the players within the locker room talk about, we feel like we're close. We feel like we're close. And, what we see on the field doesn't always mirror that. But when you take a step back and you're like 13 red zone trips, all right, and you see 13 scoring opportunities over the last 3 games to put a touchdown on the board, like, you can see why they might be feeling that way, and why there is that optimism around kind of what they're doing and how they're progressing. But to your point, like the Fleur said, it starts with the run game. The margin for error in the red zone is so small. It's a condensed part of the field. There's less space to operate within. If you don't have a run game to lean on, or you're not able to pick up, some steady yardage, 5-6 yards a clip in that part of the field, just makes passing the ball, which is already more challenging because there's less space to operate within, more difficult, especially for an offense that's been so wildly inconsistent in that aspect of the game. So that's where it all stems from. And early on in the season, they were, the water finds its level, as they say, because they were actually really efficient in the red zone early on in the year, despite not having that run game to lean on. I think, like you said, there's more, from a play design standpoint that they could try to create some opportunities in that aspect. But the positive is that they're at least moving the ball and having those opportunities to get there. And peeked ahead to the Chargers, they've given up one of the highest red zone opportunities in football this season. So hopefully something for them to continue to build on this week, but got to convert those opportunities into points. The Steelers game, as many positives as we can take away from it, was still, kind of what we've seen throughout the season, where it just missed opportunity. And on defense, special teams, from the offensive perspective, there was still just a lot left on the table for this Packers team.
It's funny how that works, because when you move the ball up and down the field, I think inherently it feels better. You get a lot of positive plays. You get a lot of, really fun stuff from Jaden Reed and Luke Musgrave that we've talked about. And you can see those, like, it's a tangible feel. You can feel it, but it doesn't take away the fact that, as you mentioned, there's still mistakes at the end of those drives that take a lot of points off the board and really leave you just wanting for more, and knowing that so much more is out there for you. I think that, that's part of the positive, is that you feel decent about some of the things that happened, and can see that there is still so much more out there for you if you just execute slightly better. That goes from a 19-point game to a 28, 29-point game, or whatever it ends up being, because they just execute slightly better, specifically in the red zone. We talked about Luke Musgrave obviously earlier. I think he's going to have to become a much better factor. I think if Aaron Jones, and I know it's not like, he was able to get a bunch going in the red zone this week, but I think if you have him through the course of the season fully healthy, that is something that certainly would have helped their red zone efficiency up until this point as well. But it needs to be better. They've got to figure out a way. I do think it starts up front on the offensive line. We go back to the fact of, this is not a mauling physical offensive line. And when you get into those really tight, condensed situations, and you need to move somebody 3 yards backwards to pick up that touchdown, that's not something that this offensive line's been really, really good at. So they're going to have to figure out something. Otherwise, it's going to probably be a lot of empty calories, a lot of yardage that ends in some field goal attempts, and a lack of touchdowns, unfortunately. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add that, as we've seen throughout the season, and, relates back to our previous conversation with Musgrave, Reed Wicks, Watson, Dobbs. Like there just isn't that go-to guy in the passing game that they can lean on to dig them out of, whatever hole they might be in the red zone. And hopefully, as we can continue to see these guys progress, even if there's not one specific option, if you have multiple options that the defense has to worry about, that can be, obviously very beneficial as well.
Do you think they need to get Jordan moving a little bit more in some of those situations as well? Because if you're taking away his ability to run, you're playing 10 on 11 in that condensed space. I think if you have the threat of him running a little bit more, now it becomes 11 on 11. You have to have somebody that's sort of responsible for him, and maybe that opens up a little bit of space somewhere else. And who knows, and maybe you can ad lib a little bit more in those situations as well. But definitely think they need to get him moving in the red zone more. I want to move over to special teams. DVOA is not perfect, and we don't need to get into all of the nuances of DVOA on today's episode. But Wendell Ferreira pointed out this week on Twitter, offense so far through 10 weeks is 18th in the NFL in DVOA. Defense is 23rd. I don't think either of those numbers are ultra surprising. That feels about right for both of those units so far. Special teams, 28th in DVOA, which also doesn't necessarily feel super surprising. I don't know if you would have told me like which one ranked worse. I don't know that special teams would have necessarily been on the top of my list. But at the same token, I do think that there just lacks a little something in special teams. And we're seeing some mistakes. Obviously, you've got a blocked extra point this week. You've got a kick out of bounds this week. We've seen some other blocked kicks. We haven't seen anything super dynamic yet, although I think Keyshawn Nixon is starting to find his groove a little bit as a returner. I think Anders Carlson, we still have to feel pretty positive about so far this year based on how he's kicked. But this Rich Bisaccia-led special teams in year 2 has not taken a significant step forward. I do think part of that is due to the fact of Rudy Ford, Keyshawn Nixon, this past week, Corey Ballantyne, some of these core special teamers having to play a ton on defense and not being available as much on special teams. I think that's a little bit of an excuse because they still have, whether they're calling up guys like Innis Gaines to the active roster. There's been a plethora of other guys that have been practice squad call-ups. It just doesn't feel quite good enough yet, and I don't know that it's been talked about a ton yet. What are your thoughts on the special teams right now?
Yeah, it feels a lot like what we're seeing on offense and defense, where there's this, once or twice a game from the special teams perspective where something just goes wrong. Yeah. And I think that's been balanced out a little bit by, like you mentioned, Keyshawn Nixon. He's getting more opportunities on kick returns as the weather turns. Jaden Reed has shown when he's had the opportunity on punt returns to be able to turn that into something. The field goal block unit, whether they get a hand on it or for whatever they're doing up front, kickers are missing against them. So I feel like there's been a number of positives as well that has balanced things out. And then, the run defense, just the ups and downs of the offense, like that's where a lot of the attention's going. So I feel like those are kind of key contributors into why it's flying under the radar. But from an execution standpoint, they're in year 2 with the Joe Barry system, Rich Bisaccia system. Like you would expect there to be this kind of step forward. And to your point, and I know Rich Bisaccia has mentioned this in a few of his different media availabilities, talking about how, they've had a lot of turnover this season at some specific roles because poor special teams guys have had to play more defensive snaps. So their special teams load has been lightened. But I looked it up at Pro Football Focus in terms of overall snaps. 8 of the top 11 guys on special teams this year from a snap count perspective were on this unit last year. Like this isn't like the offensive side of the ball where it's this brand new unit, a ton of, inexperienced guys that they're throwing out on the football field, asking them to go execute. So from that perspective, it's a bit head scratching to me in terms of the issues that they're having. And even the new guys on this year's team, it's Christian Welch, who's been a core special teams player when his time in Baltimore. Jonathan Owens, again, has his share of special team snaps from his time in Houston. Like it's a bit head scratching right now. And we go back to kind of, 30,000 foot view of this Packers team and what Brian Gutekunst wanted it to be. I know Zach Cruz has used the term guardrails to describe, kind of keeping the car on the road this season as they navigate the ups and downs. Like special teams to me, and I think I wrote about this over the summer or the spring, like it was supposed to be that. You have
Yeah.
Rich Bisaccia in year 2. They've, unlike in years past, the last 2 offseasons, they've invested in that unit. This was supposed to be, a foundational piece, and as special teams, it's not going to be what you lean on to go win you games by any means, but you obviously don't want it losing you games either. And not to say that it's been at that extent each week, it hasn't, but it hasn't provided that stability that I think the Packers were banking on to, convert scoring opportunities when they can, to not lose the field position battle, not let extra point attempts get blocked. Like, there's just been that inconsistency. And again, it's another aspect, like the offensive line in the run game, the veteran defense of, all right, here's what we have to hang our hat on this season. And it just hasn't quite provided that for them.
I do like the Josh Nijman secret weapon field goal block in the middle. How many players do you think would need to be on active game day rosters, and like how big would rosters have to get before you had a dedicated 7 foot, just giant right in the middle, or maybe even 2 of them to block kicks? Like 60, if it gets to 60, do you have a dedicated field goal blocker? I think you might.
I think so. I mean, if Caleb Jones gets on the active game day roster, we got him right there.
That'd be fun. Yeah, Caleb and Yash right next to each other. I'm all for it. They've at least tried to be creative with some stuff. Yash being a field goal blocker is at least one of those things. But yeah, I'm left wanting for more. I gave a lot more forgiveness in year 1 for Bisaccia because it's been like a decades long issue in Green Bay, and you don't just necessarily fix that overnight. But I wanted more in year 2, especially with the track record that Bisaccia has had. And again, as you mentioned, spending legitimate resources on special teams talent and really filling the back end of that roster. Not necessarily, like Christian Welch is a great example, right? I would be willing to bet that Brian and the staff are not super bullish on Christian Welch's long-term linebacker specialty. Like, I don't think they're like, man, we got this diamond in the rough. He's going to end up being a big time linebacker for us. We just gotta develop this kid. I think he's on there specifically to be a big time special teams player. And I think Dallin Levitt, same thing. Like, Dallin Levitt is on this team to be a special teams guy. They have filled the back of this roster specifically with players that are not high-end upside players that we're going to keep trying to develop, and hopefully they become starters down the road. These are guys that are on this team right now to be special teams specialists. I haven't seen quite enough of that high-end play from anybody to really make me feel super excited about it. Maybe that turns around. Maybe that takes more than a year and a half, and I'm hopeful that that's maybe the case, but just wanting a little bit more right now.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
Let's talk about one more before we get out of here. I think I don't think we haven't talked Joe Barry's defense because I think it's all been said, right? But I thought an interesting stat came across today. Arjun Menon over on the old X said he ran all the numbers from weeks 1 through 10 for all the defenses, and these are most explosive plays allowed by defenses through 10 weeks of the season. Now, Arjun is not looking at this from a Packers point of view. He put this together as a all-encompassing NFL point of view. The numbers that he chose are somewhat arbitrary. How we define an explosive play could be 25 yards, could be 40 yards. That could be defined in a variety of different ways. The thresholds that he chose, again, I think for how he defined an explosive play was 10 plus yards in the running game and 20 plus yards in the passing game. And Green Bay has allowed 30 10 plus yard rushing attempts, which is on the very high percentage so far. They've allowed 25 20 plus yard pass completions, which is not terrible. That's actually on the decent side of things. But overall, 55 explosive plays, again, over 10 yards rushing, over 20 yards receiving on a specific play, which is 5th most per game in the NFL. It's telling in the fact that this is the one thing they're supposed to be focusing on defensively in this system. If we know that Joe Barry's system is trying to really do one thing, it's limit explosives. And you're trying to basically say, hey, we're willing to give up some rushing yards. We're willing to give up some underneath completions. We're willing to give up a decent amount of that stuff. And you can you can, paper cut us to death, but you're not going to get the explosives. And we're going to make sure that we don't allow you in the red zone to get those touchdowns. Whether we want to call that bend but don't break or whatever we want to call it, we're going to put the umbrella over the top. We're going to make sure you don't get those explosives. But Green Bay, at least according to this, and it defined as, again, the 10 and 20 yarders in the run and passing game, specifically fifth most. So if you're not getting the turnovers, you're not getting the time of possession, you're not stopping the explosives, man, it's getting harder and harder to be like, what do they do well, Paul? Because it's getting harder to figure that.
You laid it all out right there. I was going to say, remind me again, Andy, what's the MO of the Joe Barry defense? What are we trying to accomplish here? And, in terms of the explosive passing plays, like, let me know if I'm missing it, but not a lot come to mind where it's over the head. Like, no, they're not getting beat deep, in that regard on the downfield passing play, but there's way too much space to operate within. And they just don't have, as we've seen, they don't have the tacklers to play that style of football necessarily as effectively as you'd hope, where keep everything in front of you, rally to the football, bring the ball carrier down. Like, that Vikings game was a prime example of that. I think Bill Huber crunched the numbers. The Packers put the Vikings in 12, 3rd and 8 or longer. Like, that's what you want. They were executing on 1st and 2nd down, but the Vikings ended up, I think, converting 11 of their 18 total opportunities in that game because they were just attacking the middle of the field where the space was, yards after the catch, and Green Bay wasn't able to tackle them, before the 1st down marker. Like, that's very much an issue where it feels like what they want to accomplish defensively from a schematic standpoint isn't matching the guys that they have on the field to be able to go and execute that, that the tackling aspect of it, the rallying to the football, everything that goes into that. And then, I mean, we all know the issues in the run game and giving up those big plays. The Matt LaFleur press conference on Monday, obviously there was a lot of time spent on the run defense aspect of it, but he's, in my understanding and what I've observed, he's done this throughout the season, but he continues to really, really harp on it's the players. And not to say that, we all see it, not to say that there aren't situations where these players aren't being put in positions to be successful, but he was really, really going back to that aspect of it. I mean, Rob Demoski had the stat, I think it was 3.6 yards per rush before the Steelers running backs were even being contacted by Green Bay. Like, yeah, there were times where they were maybe not, or weren't in the best positions to be successful, but there were plenty of times too where they weren't doing their assignment correctly. They weren't in the right gap, or they were just getting straight blown off the football. Like, to me, listening to all that was my biggest takeaway from it. And, he even referenced the Steelers defense saying, they played a lot of cover 2 against our offense and they were able to stop us, kind of like, well, we did that, but we weren't able to stop them either. So, it's everything, it's, we can always go back to the Joe Barry and the situational football and the lack of awareness at times in that regard, but the players too, they just aren't executing anywhere nearly consistent enough. And then we're seeing the ripple effects of that, and that bend, but don't break style. Like, you need complementary football for that to be effective. If you're going to give up 9-10 play drives, whether it ends in a field goal, whether it doesn't, better hope your offense strings together at least a few first downs so you get a break and you're not back out on the football field and in that situation again. We've seen that over and over and over this season, and just the vicious cycle that this Packers defense and then team as a whole gets in. And I think another component layer to all this is that they're just not generating enough pressure, like, consistently as a unit. Rashawn Gary, we all know how gaudy his numbers are, but again, if you're going to give that cushion to protect overhead, like, you need your guys to get home. Otherwise, it's just going to be, again, I referenced that Vikings game because it just felt like a prime example of it. It's just going to be pitch and catch all day, over the middle, in space, yards after the catch opportunity. So I feel like the Packers' ability to create consistent pressure and, hey, get home with a blitz, that they have not been effective in that regard either this season, getting after the quarterback. So it's just, you need the complementary football. You need the ability to get after the quarterback. It's everything. And it just gets magnified when all combined, it's just not being executed. And even though you're out there to not give up big plays, you're still giving up the big plays.
Well said. It is everything. And I am glad that you pointed that out, because one thing, and this is, and I say this every time it even starts, like I'm trying to defend Joe Barry. I am not trying to defend Joe Barry. I don't want to carry that flag. That's not what I'm trying to do here. I do think one of the things that gets overblown and sort of shoved in Joe Barry's face specifically is man, they got 8 first-round picks. Like, it has to be, they got 8 first-round picks. They got 8 first-round picks. The first thing I will say is, well, Darnell Savage is out right now. Eric Stokes is out. Jair Alexander is out. Like, there, you've got a decent amount of first round of those. That's 3 first round picks right there that are not playing right now. The next thing I will say is you've got a Lucas Van Ness, who is certainly not playing like a high end player. And maybe just instead of going through each of these, the easier thing would be who on this defense is playing at a very high level right now. It's basically like Rashawn Gary. And then the next person on that list was Rasul Douglas, in my opinion, and they just kind of traded that guy away. So, like, we can argue all you want, like, oh man, look at all the first round picks he's got. A, 3 of those guys aren't playing, and B, the only one that's really playing at that level and is really playing really great football, in my opinion, is Rashawn Gary. There's just not, if you're talking about Pro Bowl caliber style players on this Packers defense, it's Rashawn, and that's it. And even because the edge pool is so talented right now, even Rashawn's probably not in that conversation just because of the amount of snaps that he missed early in the season and those sort of things. So I do think that if the default is like, oh, the 8 first round picks, look at all the talent, I think we're smart enough at this point to say, all right, this is not a ultra talented Packers defense. There's some good players on it, and you would like some of these players to be playing better. I can point to a Devontae Wyatt, who I think might be better in a different system. And there's some other players who I think that might be the case for as well. So we could have a whole nother debate and argument of like, are all of these players being used to the best of their abilities? And I think we could probably come to a conclusion down the road of like, yeah, there's a lot of players that maybe could be used differently, but I do think that players need to play better. I do not think this is a stacked Packers defense full of, ultra talented maybe, but not guys that are playing at a high level. And I also think that a lot of times these defenders are not being put in the best possible positions to succeed. And at the end of the day, and where I kind of wanted to go with this from the onset of like, all right, they're also giving up big plays. You have to find something you do well, whether that, and this is the biggest thing, and I've preached it for 3 years of the Joe Barry, regime at this point, is what is your MO? What is it that you do well? What is your identity? You have to find something. This is not a hard-hitting, physical, smash you in the mouth defense. This is not a, hey, we are extremely assignment sure and we are all on the same page, ultra communicative defense. This is not a ball hawking, we are going to rip away the football and get takeaways defense. This is not a high pressure, we are going to blitz the crap out of you and make you crap your pants defense. This is not a bend but don't break successful defense. This is not, we are going to limit explosive plays defense. This is not any style that you want to be, anything that you want to put in there. It has not been the case. And that's my biggest thing is at some point, regardless of the players that you have, regardless of the system that you're running, regardless of everything else, you have to be good at something. And there just isn't that one thing right now for Green Bay.
Yeah, and one other thing I just want to add, going on about, LaFleur talking about how the players have to be better. Like for me, his press conference on Monday, it also kind of brought back to light that, he's the head coach. Like he's agreeing on what these game plans are. Like
Yep.
he even said in that press conference that what we asked our guys to do defensively in that game, there was nothing that we did not practice throughout the week. Now he pointed to, there's times situationally where they could have done things different. Like he wasn't absolving Joe Barry of everything by any means, but what they're doing defensively, what the players are being asked to do, the positions are being put in, like he's signing off on that, heading into the game. Obviously it's Joe Barry's discretion as things unfold, but the overall game plan, what they're asking them to do, LaFleur's does have say in that. I mean, the Raiders game is a prime example of that, where after the Lions game, like philosophically, we have to do things different. And we did see in that Raiders game a bit of a different, I won't say aggressive, I'll say less passive defense in that game. And so, he does and has that ability, obviously, as head coach to do so. But to me, that kind of brought back to light just that, because for, could be forgotten about, that aspect of it of, hey, he is the head coach. He's signing off on this. This is what they're going out and doing.
No, I'm right there. And there is a level of responsibility for Matt. If nothing else, like you said, there's like, he's responsible for this too, and he's signing off on it. And yeah, like I said, everyone's talked about defense all week. We're not going to necessarily bring anything too crazy to the table here that hasn't been talked about already, but just not good enough. It needs to be better. And one other thing I was going to say is, like, we've been talking about like the explosive pass plays that went over Green Bay's head and things like that. And one of the best wide receiver quarterback combos that Green Bay's faced so far. Justin Fields, DJ Moore, week 1. You've got Addison and Cousins. You've got, Amon-Ra St. Brown played in the Lions game, I think, if I remember correctly. So. But Jared Goff, Amon-Ra St. Brown. That's probably your best 3 that they've faced, because Stafford was out for the Rams. Jefferson was out for the Vikings. I don't know, maybe Sutton and Russell Wilson, or Wilson and Judy. I don't, like, obviously Adams is an amazing wide receiver, and Kupp is an amazing wide receiver, but it's Garoppolo and it's ripping in those games. They haven't played the big explosive, quarterback wide receiver duos yet. And Mahomes is coming to town. They're going to get Goff and Amon-Ra St. Brown again. Justin Herbert's coming to town. Like, we're going to see if that defense is actually capable of maybe keeping everything in front of them. I think things could be a little bit different against better quarterbacks as well, but hopefully I am wrong, because it would be great if they just went out and balled out and they actually, showed some real improvement on defense. That'd be great. Paul, amazing stuff as always. Where can we find all of your amazing work, and where can we find you on social media?
Appreciate it, Andy. Find out my work over at Packers Wire. Hit subscribe on YouTube, Paul Bretl, and follow me on Twitter at Paul_Bretl. Definitely
do so. Definitely check out his YouTube channel. You're not going to want to miss that. You can follow me at Andy Herman NFL. You can follow the podcast at Pack a Day Podcast. That is going to do it for us. We'll see Paul again next week. I will see you tomorrow right back here on an all new Pack a Day Podcast. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.